Thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here. I've known Hugh for a very long time, so long that I can't remember when and how we met, except it was a long time ago. His book, A Year in Lapland, A Guest of the Reindeer Herders, was a serious ethnographic account, but also a beautiful literary evocation. But perhaps less well known, this was preceded by Reindeer Herd Management in Transition. And at 562 pages, this was like a reindeer in autumn. Very, very fat. And it's probably the fattest book that ever came out in the Acta Universitatis Uppsaliensis. But in that title, note the word transition. And for decades, Hugh has been caring deeply about changes in the lives of reindeer herders in Kola, Chukotka, Alaska, even China. Teaching students, collaborating with other scholars, most adventurously, I suppose, with a wide circle of Russian ethnographers in a landmark volume. Dmitry Fulk was one of those people. Volume entitled Post-Soviet Transformations. So transformations, transition, change. Now, changing epistemologies might have been enough for many colder intellectuals. But the title of the symposium adds, and life. And this is an acknowledgement, I think, of Hugh's humaneness and generosity of spirit. He's endlessly fascinated by human life. And through his reindeer herders, he has explored life for decades, and I hope he'll keep on exploring it for many more decades. Well, what about epistemology? I understand epistemology as secular camouflage for religion. And religious change is an ancient and repeated event in human history. Conversion remains one of the most significant processes in human life, but very mysterious. How can people abandon one understanding of reality and so quickly revision the world in a new and totally different way? That the explanations they had before no longer work, I think was a phrase that occurred this morning. Well, right here in Sweden, of course, we had, 1,000 years ago, Vikings became Christian. Much more recently, Sami became Christian. And there were very vicious trials for thraldom, for witchcraft. And eventually this led to Laestadius in the 19th century as a kind of compromise, and the Sami cultural revivalist movements of today. The program organisers kindly invented a title for me to do with Siberian reindeer. But when I saw the symposium title, I decided to talk about another indigenous minority and their political situation in another huge multi-ethnic state. So I'm going to explore a drastic change which has occurred during the time I have known the tribal Sora of Orissa in India. This closely echoes what happened among the Sami here 300 years ago, but I've lived through it myself during the past 40 years. The Sora were not Hindu, but animist. And when I first stayed with them in the 1970s, they had a non-literate cosmology, which was characterized by open-ended negotiation between the living and the dead. Almost every day, in every Sora village, a female shaman would go into trance and a succession of dead people would speak through her mouth, holding casual conversations or impassioned arguments with groups of living people who squatted around her. But in these 40 years I've been going there, as younger Sora enter the literate world of school and the national space of party politics, they're becoming either Baptist Christians or fundamentalist Hindus. And between them, these mutually hostile paths towards modernity squeeze out the shamanist worldview of their elders. Today I'll have time to talk only about the Baptists, but remember there is a huge Hindu story as well. Well, for those animists, 40 years ago, there was plenty to talk about. The dead caused illness and death by transferring the symptoms of their own death onto the living. So in that way they created an analogy between the narratives of the attacker and of the victim, a continuity between the biographies of a succession of persons. And rather than spirit, I'll use the indigenous word sonum, which is slightly different from spirit. So the living were susceptible to these attacks because they felt compassion for the dead. And they would respond defensively to these attacks by persuading the dead over many years of dialogue into a progressively less dangerous, subjective inner state. So a dead person who was still in shock would seek to perpetuate the form of his own death onto others closer to him. But a dead person who had been persuaded to accept his new state would gradually stop doing harm and join his patrilineal ancestors in the underworld. So you have a situation in which all illnesses and deaths are caused by dead people who have themselves suffered from similar symptoms. So every time you fall ill, it's a reminder of your attachment to a dead person who has started to eat your soul, thereby repeating the same symptoms in you that he suffered from himself. And the cure consists in offering him the soul of a sacrificial animal as a substitute for your own soul. If he accepts the substitute, you recover. If not, you die from a repetition of his illness. So it's like any medical system. Some people get better and some don't. Once you're dead, you will join him in whatever location on the landscape he is. It might be a tree, a rock, a stream. It's a location which corresponds to the symptoms that you now both share. So people who die of smallpox, people who die from the leopard, reside in the site of a smallpox collective or a leopard collective. And there are people who die from other causes and go into the sun, they go into the earth, wherever. And from there they return as the most recent agent of that form of death to attack other people. So here's a dialogue with a little girl who's just died, and she's joined the collective of leprosy victims. She arrives from the underworld, the shaman's sitting like this, and the girl starts speaking. "Mummy, where are my golden nose rings?" And the adults start crowding around. They say, "They must have burnt up in the funeral pyre. We looked, we couldn't find them." She says, "I want my nose rings, I want my nose rings." And they say, "Look, don't feel resentful. Think, when you were ill, we did all those sacrifices. We killed buffaloes and goats and pigs. We killed everything. We did our best." And still the little girl is saying, "Mummy, you didn't care about me enough. And I came out in scars all over. My fingers dropped off. That was passed on to me by somebody else." And then one of the women there says, "But don't you pass it on. Don't give it to your mother. Don't give it to your little sisters." And she says, "If I grab them, I grab them. If I touch them, I touch them. If I pass it on, I pass it on. That's just how it goes." And then as she goes back to the underworld, she calls out, "My mummy doesn't care enough about me." Now, this is very harrowing and very persuasive, because what this little girl is saying is what we might say the mother's own self-reproach is. But it's what we might introject, they project outwards. So the living and the dead are involved in constructing a shared consciousness with a close correlation between emotional distress in the mourner and a tendency to attack in the deceased. Let me just show you a snatch of film. What you will see is a shaman in trance with various women crowding around and weeping and embracing him and banging their heads together. Unfortunately, in this film, the shaman is a man, but you have to realise that usually these shamans are women, and there will be a gender point later on about this. We hope we can make it. They're offering the dead person all his clothes and all of the jewelry. So now the dead person speaks. off, thanks. So the emotional tone of this dialogue shifts over the years. The living and the dead gradually set each other at ease through a mutual persuasion. And at first, the sense of victimhood prevails in the dead person, so the dead person is aggressive and dangerous. And over several years, the mourners have to persuade the deceased into a less aggrieved state of mind. And the shaman's assistants perform rituals and sing songs to lead the dead person from the anti-society of his fellow illness victims and lead him into the company of his ancestors in the underworld. So there's a kind of resolution, but it's very slow, and as you can see, it's a very painful process. And an old ancestor who's been dead for a long time no longer upsets us when he comes and talks to us, and no longer causes illness. And finally, he gives his name back to a new baby among his descendants. This is not actually a reincarnation, but the name comes back. Now, the ritual to rescue the deceased from the experience of his own death is called redeeming him. Literally, buying him back from the sonams who took him and reuniting him with his ancestors. And I'm going to explore this word. The reason why illnesses continue to occur, of course, is that the dead person doesn't stay in his newly redeemed state, but keeps on reverting spontaneously and so on. And I think this corresponds also to resurgences of grief among the mourners. So that little girl that I read out, 2 or 3 years later, she was saying, "You were a very good mummy, you did everything you could for me, you know, and now I'm just going to become an ancestor and give my name back to a new sister." This ritual process seems very ancient, and I saw it as so fulfilling that I was shocked when the whole system collapsed very quickly and the next generation turned to baptism. It was a shock for me because I'd made a whole career out of going around saying how wonderful this system was, and my special fans were psychoanalysts, even more than anthropologists. So how did the old way of life, which meant so much, so recently, fail so suddenly? What I failed to understand in the 1970s was the link between this old religion and feudal oppression. Can you still hear me? Is this in the right place? Down? Down. Like... Like that? So when I first arrived there in the 1970s, these animist Sora were living in a position of unremitting humiliation, ethnically, economically, and politically. And this power regime was starkly reflected by the shamans themselves, because even when operating their un-Hindu tribal cosmology, those Sora shamans gained their powers by marrying high-caste Hindu spirits in the underworld. So those high-caste spirits, they were rajas, policemen, clerks, anybody who had the weapons of guns and literacy. These underworld spirits could speak the local administrative language. They could write down the names of miscreants in their underworld, in their logbooks of their underworld police stations. So you can see that the standard Christian evangelical discourse of coming out of darkness into light maps well onto the wider Indian nation-building project and the Sora's own desire to emerge out of marginality into the mainstream. So, older people now are afraid to die because they know their children won't talk to them after death or feed them with buffaloes. But younger people feel liberated as they become literate in Sora and Oriya, that's the government language, and they give up primitive customs and subsistence agriculture to join the scramble for jobs as road labourers, church officials, or government school teachers. Now, this new form of religiosity directs spiritual energy away from ancestors towards God and Jesus instead. And there are many other changes associated with this. There's a shift from female shamans and robust family banter that you heard to respectful monologic forms of prayer to a male god, mediated always through a male pastor. The living no longer communicate with the dead. They no longer articulate their compassion for them, and by the same token, they're no longer susceptible to their attacks of illness. And indeed, now that government dispensaries and hospitals are available, when you go there, the diagnosis is never in terms of ancestors. It's always in terms of something medical. The ancestors become hungry and lonely, but they're powerless to harm us or protect us. But for the young, Jesus helps them to get government jobs. And it's significant that the takeover by Christianity, which happened in the 1980s, is directly linked to the arrival of roads, schooling, literacy, employment, and a flood of development cash from the government. But it makes it impossible to communicate with the dead, even if you're a dog, since the entire Baptist cosmology renders the realm of death itself unknowable and unexplorable. Now, a discourse of rupture is inherent in the rhetoric and experience of evangelical conversion. This discourse intentionally cuts across whatever your previous cosmology and religion were. So here it cuts across this animist principle of continuity through forms of repetition and recycling, which merely lead back to the local social structure. Funerals based on lineages now are replaced by church events based on parishes. And at the heart of this cosmological change lies an attack on the principles and logic of animist causality. For Baptists, dialogues with the dead are forbidden because they reinforce attachment between the living and the dead, and they therefore encourage backsliding from the new regime. But they're also pointless, these dialogues, because there's nothing left to discuss. If the dead don't cause anything in our life, if illness is not caused by our love for dead people, but by invisible insects that only doctors know about. So the living have no role in managing the ongoing state of the dead. We don't persuade them and maneuver them through dialogue. Death instead comes about through the will of God, which is not very well understood. I've spent years trying to find out what the will of God is. But the one thing you know is you can't ask about it because there's no answer. Now, this cosmology of radical change has clear political undertones. And early Sora converts, it turns out, long before I got there, were already composing hymns with a tone of liberation theology. So in the late 1940s, when India became independent, the government abolished an oppressive feudal system of bonded labour. And the newly released Sora labourers sang, from today, firewood gathering slavery is finished. From today, firewood gathering slavery is abolished. And an early Sora Baptist pastor adapted this song. After renouncing all these primitive, bad old practices like blood sacrifice and drinking and smoking and fornicating and so on, his hymn ends, from today, I have joined God's group. From today, I have joined God's team. So you can see that the song about slavery said only what liberation was from. But the Christian adaptation says what the liberation will be to. Baptism would not only bring liberation from oppressive entanglements, it would also complete the rupture by turning the Sora into new persons with a new kind of relationship to a new kind of divinity. Now, these entanglements that they were freeing themselves from were with needy ancestors who needed feeding all the time, just as much as with exploitative outsiders, you know, the police who demanded bribes and so on. So, this is directly connected to the suppression of dialogue. While the shaman embodied and invoiced the deceased in order to discuss how he was, and that's what you saw in the film, the Christian tomb leaves this closed to inquiry. The pastor, when you bury somebody now, the pastor reads from the Bible and leads prayers, but there is no drumming or dancing, no lamenting, and no discussion of the dead person's life, and no discussion of where he is now. Where has he gone? And you can see that emotionality itself has been inverted, because the animists say that if we keep talking to a dead person, we feel better. It soothes our grief. The Christians say, on the contrary, if you keep talking to the dead person, it keeps you sad. And a young Christian told me simply, remembering makes you ill. Summed up beautifully. So I'd just like to show you now, this is in the Baptist church. And I'd like you to notice, do you remember the intense physicality of these embraces between shaman and mourner? Now you see the pastor, he's on a platform, he's behind a table, and everybody else sits on the floor. Instead of dialogue, we have monologue. And what you'll hear him saying is, God is not pleased with you, you're not good enough, you've been doing all sorts of sinful things all week, and now it's Sunday and we're going to denounce you, and so on. So let's just hear that for a moment. Okay, thanks. That's back to a shaman. Much more my world there. So the pastor does not embody those whom we've loved in his own body, and in his speech he doesn't enverb them. Instead, he's a conduit for the words of God and Jesus, from whom he, however, always remains separate. And the Bible is not really, there's no tradition of written commentary. They don't discuss the meaning of the Bible very much. The men on the platform are the only source of authority, as you could see from that, the whole layout of that system. So the old religion had fetishized writing from a position of weakness by making it the key technique of spiritual power, in which literate helper spirits enabled the articulacy of dialogue. Now the universal literacy of the Christians makes the old-timers' awe of the mystique of writing seem ridiculous. So young kids who go to school and read the Bible in church and so on, they can't take that seriously. So the animists didn't really understand what was being written by these shamans' familiar spirits, except that it gave the writers power over those who were being written about. But the Christians have captured this power more directly by mastering it themselves. So if you look at the framework of an animist ritual, you summon the dead, you debate with them, you feed them, and then you dismiss them. And there is a climax when the sonum accepts the sacrifice, and then with luck you're going to get better. But otherwise the structure creates rises and falls in dramatic tension in which you vary your level of engagement. As you saw in that first bit of film, the chants and dialogues can last for hours, but people wander off, they interrupt, they snooze while waiting for moments of particular interest. It's like a long-distance telephone exchange. Hey, it's your mother, come and talk to him. But in church, everybody is supposed to be in a uniform state of permanent high alertness. And there's actually a marshal with a stick who goes up and down, prodding anybody who starts to sleep. So in the services, I could not locate the climax. I couldn't locate any point at which something actually happened, until I realized this is exactly what the Baptists have abolished. There is indeed no climax, there's no turning point. So an animist ritual persuades by negotiation within a kin group, but a Baptist service persuades by assertion. Like a political speech, it's not so much a ritual as a rally. So in this new kind of performance, as you saw, dialogue is replaced by monologue, and you participate not by speaking, but by being spoken to. So if we go back to this word of redemption that I've established earlier on, we can see the radical shift in the meaning of this. The metaphor is the same. Just as the shaman's assistants would sing of buying back the deceased with sacrificial buffaloes, so the Bible says that we are redeemed with the blood of Jesus. But here's the difference. The sense of blood is the same, but animists needed to be redeemed after death, from the experience of death. Baptists need to be redeemed, even while they're alive, from the new concept of sin. And that's exactly what that pastor was going on about at the time. So young Sora, who've been brought up tightly within the church, now know nothing at all of the old religion. And they assure me that their parents used to walk in darkness and worship devils. So I'm a rather strange phenomenon. I'm one of the last of the old animists. And I walk around slaughtering buffaloes and drinking alcohol and talking to the dead and so on. And these young people say, that's not good, Grandad, you shouldn't do that, we're worried about you. How many minutes do I have left? 1. Well, but there is one bit I do want to say. In the 1970s, I thought of dialogues with the dead as the defining essence of Sora religion. Well, was I wrong? I've seen these new Christian and Hindu forms closing in on the Sora shamans. Now, do these new movements spell the end of Sora religion, or are they new Sora religions? And though I didn't understand it at the time, the world I inhabited in the 1970s was already obsolete. And the outsiders who were kept at arm's length had to be engaged in new ways. So the point now for young people is not simply to fend them off or co-opt them by marrying them in the underworld, but to find ways of joining them. So Baptists seek a way of being Sora with no reference to Sonams at all. Jesus' message supersedes all other religions. So this is rupture as a core ideology. And the neo-Hindu movements, which I can't discuss today, they don't so much reject the old religion as clean it up. They are reformists. Stop doing sacrifice and you can become proper, clean, bourgeois Hindus. And this broadening of the field as people join this wider nation-state is accompanied by a change in the ontology of the beings who serve as the focus of religious energy. For animists, the entire cosmos is ancestorized. Even the sun, even the earth are knowable only through the words spoken by dead Sora relatives whom they've absorbed. Well, none of these other new Sora religions holds dialogues with the dead. So none of them have this intimate family drama. Instead, they all have devotion. In every one of these new religions, Christian or Hindu, there's a shift of attention from ancestors to gods, from a more immanent metaphysics to a more transcendent one. And these religious styles also bring the Sora closer to the state and other modernist political structures. It's hard to claim the loyalty of people whose focus is all on their ancestors, but much easier to do by means of Jesus or Krishna. So the gods are objects of prayer, which is a format unknown to the animists. And the implication is that ordinary ancestors are not enough for a proper theology. The shift to gods introduces a new level of respect for such being, which is justified not only by their distance, they're up in the sky or somewhere, but also by a dignity which comes from a lack of neediness in their relationship with us. They don't need anything from us. And this dignity matches a reformist tendency throughout India, which I think is linked to a bourgeois aesthetics of a rising middle class. How might this affect our understanding of redemption as a release from suffering? Well, we've seen a close parallel between spiritual redemption and political emancipation. The culture that I witnessed in the 1970s linked an archaic metaphysics with an archaic system of domination. Sora dialogues with the dead were ultimately defensive in relation to everyone, from the most distant officials to your own dead relatives. They were structured to deflect attack and transform victimhood. Now here's the interesting historical conclusion. Maybe those dialogues were themselves once a new religious form, a response to the arrival of feudal structures, a new religion that emerged in its time and is now fading in its time. So I think there's a psychic price for Sora political emancipation, which is this middle generation of people who want to talk to the dead but are not allowed to. Older people then are distressed at being cut off from their dead, but the young, instead of being persecuted by officials, are now becoming bureaucrats and policemen themselves. But their ideology of rupture is so extreme that it may be a long time before there is a Sora Laestadius. Thank you very much.